It's Lou Rosenfeld, and I'm really pleased to have in today's conversation Brett Helquist and Deb Gelman. Brett, you may not know if you're a UX person, but if you're a parent, you almost definitely know his work. He has, among other things, illustrated popular books like the Lemony Snicket series, as well as written his own books and illustrated those too. Deb, you may know because she is the author of Design for Kids, which is debuting in July of 2014. That might be past tense by the time you hear this podcast. And I've been thinking about both of them and the interesting things that they do in terms of designing for kids, but they do it from very different perspectives. Brett is an illustrator, Deb as a user experience practitioner, and I wanted to get them together and compare notes a bit and see what was similar, what's different. And I think there's going to be some interesting overlaps, but maybe some surprises as well. So with that, I'd like to welcome you both. I really wanted to delve a bit into what's common here, besides the fact that you're both doing work for kids, that you're both designing, in effect, for kids. And one of the things that seems certainly apparent is that you're both doing a form of storytelling. And Brett, are you a storyteller as much as an illustrator, or are they one and the same?
Yeah, definitely. For the last 12 years or so, I've pretty much illustrated only books, and so my illustration work is almost always narrative. And I do everything from middle grade novels, aren't always heavily illustrated, but the illustrations are used to kind of move the story along and to add some visual detail and help the readers kind of navigate the story. And then I also do picture books where the pictures are, integral to the storytelling. The book wouldn't really work without the pictures. So I definitely think of myself as a storyteller.
In cases like the Lemony Snicket books, do you feel that you're exclusively telling a story that the authors come up with, or does your work retell or add to the story in any way from your perspective?
Yeah, I do my best to add what I can. And saying that, I have great respect for the authors. I read the books very carefully to make sure I get the details right. And when I say add to the story, I don't try to distract from the storyline or the general motion of the story. When I say add, it's kind of adding a little color, adding a little life, a little more depth, so the world that the author is trying to create in words just becomes a little more vivid and alive to the reader. That's what I aim for.
So the authors and the publishers, I imagine, together to some degree pick you because they appreciate your form of visual storytelling. But do you ever get into situations where they feel like maybe you've gone a little too far and maybe taken too much ownership of the story? Because I'm going to ask Deb pretty much the same question in a minute, and in our field that can be a big issue in terms of how designers interpret stories for their clients.
Yeah, that's never really happened. There are occasions when I notice a little visual detail that I think would make an interesting picture that doesn't, on an occasion or two, it didn't quite work with the story, and I've suggested the possibility of changing it. And these are just minor details, might be a hair color or a costume detail or something like that. But beyond that, and sometimes they've told me yes sometimes and sometimes no, and I just respect either answer. But other than that, I've never really had that problem. Like I say, I read the text very carefully and try really hard to respect the work that the author has put into it and the story they want to tell. And just like my main goal, like I said, was to add some color and some depth and just kind of flesh out the world a little bit, not really make it my own per se.
Right. And in terms of guidelines, are they giving you pretty tight requirements, like we need an illustration here at this point in the story, or we want, X number per chapter, but whatever you think, wherever it would work the best, or how does that work typically?
Yeah, that's talked about before we begin the process, and sometimes it's just a matter of how much money they want to spend on the project, and I tell them what I can do for that price. So sometimes if it's more open, if they just want it fully illustrated, then I usually read the book and think of every possible image that I think would work with the story, and then I talk it over with the author and editor usually, and we decide, which of my ideas are the strongest and which ones don't work very well, and we kind of talk it out. And then you have to also consider just the pacing, so you don't get your illustrations all jumbled up in one corner of the book and then 100 pages with nothing. So we talk about that and try to even it out and just make it a good experience. So most of those details are decided together early on in the project.
Okay, so yeah, I like that you use that word experience because that's a good segue onto what Deb does, which is ensure a good user experience. And so why don't we turn it to Deb? Do you like this term storyteller as a way to explain what you do, Deb?
I do. I think it's a very apt description of what it is that we do as interaction designers, especially when we're designing for kids. And it's funny because there's this misconception out there that kids love things that are nonlinear. They love everything on a screen to move or do something and provide that immediate feedback. The truth of the matter is kids need some sort of narrative or some sort of structure to guide them through the experience. And I've seen a lot of designers come to the table with really abstract ideas that aren't pulled together in any sort of a story. And when you do that, you run the risk of alienating the kids and having them go off and do something that is more structured because they don't really appreciate interactions that feel more of a free-for-all. So I think it's necessary to, even if the initial idea isn't crafted the way a traditional story would be crafted, it's important to drive out that story from either the client or from the sponsor or whomever is approaching you to do the project, because that's the only way the kids are going to really respond. They need to have a purpose, and that purpose needs to be really driven, much like a story.
So, okay, but for different ages, their grasp of narrative, or conversely, maybe of more abstract story, probably changes quite a bit, right?
Absolutely. For the younger kids, it can be as simple as, here's the cat. When you click on the cat says meow. And then when you click on the dog barks, and then at the end they're together and the cat's meowing and the dog's barking. It doesn't have to have it doesn't have to have a conflict, and it doesn't have to have a protagonist or anything like that. But it does have to have a general structure to lead the young user through the story that you're telling. For older audiences, it gets really interesting. We have to think about things like leveling up. We have to think about things like progression. We have to think about things like rewards. And all of those are key components to any type of story that you're telling in an interactive space. So when you're working with 6 to 8-year-olds, they need to feel as though what they're doing has a purpose and a progression as well, and that they're actually advancing as they go. And that storyline can be part of the advancement. And even if the app or the game or the interaction that they're engaging with is more educational or is more of a game, there still has to be something propelling them through to something on the other side. So even though they're in it for the journey has to be interesting and engaging and unfold as they go through the experience.
So I'll turn it back to Brett. You mentioned a little bit about doing different types of illustration for different types of books, and I assume for different age groups by extension. Do you feel like you handle the 2 to 4-year-olds very differently than the 8 to 10-year-olds? Is there a big a variation in age group from your perspective?
Yeah, not so much stylistically. I think the pictures I do are fairly similar. I use the same techniques, but a picture book for a young reader is in a lot of ways, the pictures are really driving the story, so they're sometimes very sequential, and the flow between pictures is very fluid. You go from one moment to the next moment right away, and there can't be usually not a lot of big time gaps between a picture and a picture book. Whereas the middle grade illustrated novels, I'm just illustrating select moments at different points of the story, but there's not a clear connection between two pictures. One picture is just a moment in the story, and then days and weeks can happen in the storyline before the next picture pops up. So I don't illustrate that the flow of the story from moment to moment. Where the picture book, it really is. It's a lot like it's very visual, and it's in some ways a lot like a cartoon, almost a storyboard of a simple cartoon. Sometimes where you're the one picture happens, and then a second later the next picture is happening. There's usually not a lot of time between images.
So, Brett, it sounds like then it's the variation for age groups is less about the actual illustrations, more about the flow or cadence, and how much the reader can handle kind of carrying the story themselves to some degree in terms of how they read.
Yeah, I think so.
So you mentioned storyboards, and I'm wondering if that's your main tool for knowing how well your work succeeds. Is that how you evaluate, in effect, what you design? And are there other ways or other tools that you use to find out if your work is actually succeeding?
Yeah, I mean, I like to, every chance I get, I read my work to kids at schools and bookstore events and things, and read them to my own kids also. And, I feel like I've succeeded if they understand the story, if they laugh at the parts that I was intending to be funny, if they kind of just, if they've understood the story without me explaining it, if I can just read it to them and show them the pictures and they get the story.
But can you do that before you have a finished product, like with a storyboard or some sort of prototype?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Yeah. Well, like I say, when I do meet school children, if I'm working on a project, I'll usually read them one of my published books, and then if I've got another book that's far enough along, I will show them some of that, and just part of it's to show them that they enjoy learning the process of what I'm doing. But I also take advantage of them and just read a little bit of it to them and see if they're understanding the story, if they're responding to it in the way that I hope they will. And I do that with my own children too. Sometimes with my kids, I just show them a sketch of a picture I'm working on and just ask them to tell me what they're seeing. And if they're missing the important detail, I know I've got some work to do. So I just usually, I don't do any formal testing. It's just more informal things like that with friends and family and school children when I get a chance to.
Okay. And what about you, Deb? I mean, obviously, in your book, you cover quite a bit around different design research methods. What do you think works best with kids? And does it vary quite a bit from age range to age range?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I think it's really important to get that gut read at the beginning of a project. So even before you have any type of interactions designed or any even type of visual imagery, it can be as easy as cutting pictures out of a magazine or getting a bunch of stuffed animals and putting them in a room and setting the stage so that the beginnings of the narrative are there, and then just observing the kids, what they do with what you've shown them, how are they taking the story to the next level, give them the framework, and then watch them unfold it. And that will allow you to see if you're going in the right direction or if they're thinking about something completely different. And it's usually a combination. They usually start out with you, and then they kind of take it down, to crazy town, which is great. And what you can do is then you can harness that information, what you've learned from observing them, and then put that into more of a formal digitized experience that they then can play. And you know that your design is working well if the kids are engaged, if they're not talking a lot, if they're absorbed in what they're doing. And you know that it's not working when kids, especially kids over the age of 8, say things like, "Oh, this app would be great for my baby sister," or I think this would be great for a younger kid. Or they may even just come right out and tell you that this is pretty lame. I don't think I would ever use that. Lame is definitely not a word that you want to hear when you're working on an app for kids. That means you have to go back to the drawing board. Or if you ask them and they say, "Oh yeah, this, I really like what this is doing." Whatever, it's fine. That's also not good. So look for those visual cues, look for those verbal cues, and try to involve kids in the process as early and as often as you can, because they will be very tuned into those nuances, and you'll be able to tell immediately what's working and what's not.
As you're describing this, I'm almost envisioning the design research that you do with kids as almost being a form of play in and of itself. I can almost envision you running body storming sessions with kids. Is it that chaotic and fun, or does it have to kind of be like traditional research?
Yeah, it actually depends on the age group. So with younger kids, it has to be chaotic and fun. You have to work with younger kids one-on-one, however, just because they tend to get very reserved. They don't engage with other kids. So when you're alone with a child and some toys and some ideas, you talk, get them started thinking about the stuff that you're trying to do, and watch what they do. And your eyes will be opened a million times over when you see the direction these kids take. And obviously, like any type of research, you're not going to take exactly what the subject says or does and use that as the basis of your design, but it absolutely can help you inform the direction. I like to do a lot of participatory design sessions, and that's where it gets super chaotic, especially when you're working with 6 to 8 year olds. You bring in a whole bunch of supplies and you let them create their own experience within the constraints that you give them. And what you end up with is just unbelievable. And it is a lot like body storming. It's very engaging. It's very involved and participatory and messy, and you really see how these kids conceptualize and think about the interactions they have on a daily basis, not just with technology, but with the people around them. And it helps you make those experiences feel a little bit more personal, a little bit more engaging, a little bit more first person, if you will. So doing that kind of research, get inside the minds of these kids and understand exactly what it is that they're looking for and what they hope to get from the experience that you're designing.
And just thinking about doing design research for you both, I would imagine that parents or some sort of guardian who makes ultimately a purchasing decision is an important audience. Do you involve them somehow as you're trying to figure out what to design?
Yeah, parents are a really important part of the research process, because what kids like and what parents like are frequently very different. In my book, I talk about something called the PTR, which is the parental threshold for the revolting. I was doing a workshop a couple years ago, and one of the participants got up and said, "My kids love games with mucus and diarrhea and horrible things." And I've seen these games, and they're really out of control. So you have to make sure, whatever it is you're designing, a parent will be amenable to purchasing it and letting their child play with it. There's a game called Why We Poo, and it's just ridiculous. And as a parent, I'm not too excited. I would not be excited to have my 5-year-old play with it. She would absolutely love it. She would think it was the funniest thing that she's ever seen. Unfortunately, she will not have the opportunity because I will not put it on my iPhone and I will not let her play with it. So to gauge that, you have to get parents involved early on. And of course, it's not as simple as just saying, "Hey, how would you feel about this concept?" It's what crosses the line for you in terms of the gross factor. What do you feel is too much? What do you feel is acceptable? What does your kid like? Why do you think they like that? And getting them to really respond on that level so that you don't get to a point where it's just so distasteful to them that they won't even purchase it.
Brett, as both an illustrator who has to think about the parental buyer in many cases, as well as a parent, do you find yourself dancing on that line that Deb was just mentioning, and sometimes crossing it?
Yeah, I hope I haven't crossed it. I probably have, but I don't really do anything formally with it. I don't do any research really, but it's on my mind all the time. Parents are the ones that buy the books, especially with the picture books. If I'm writing it myself, I just try hard to think of the parent. I spend a lot of time reading it aloud to myself just to see if it's easy to read and has a nice rhythm to it. Something that I'm sure every parent's had a book that their child loves that they just find hard to read out loud to them. It's just whether the language is clumsy or too many words or just dull. So I think about it a lot. With the middle grade, I think that age of kids, they have a lot more say in which books they end up with. But I still try to, especially on the cover, just create something that will really be engaging and grab an adult's attention, hopefully get them to pick up the book and consider it for their child.
I'm envisioning you right now in sneaking around the bookstore here in our neighborhood in Park Slope and watching parents as they thumb through the section of books that you've had something to do with. Let's kind of wrap it up with something of a trick question. How would you each help the other? If you had Deb with all her skills in design research in your employ, what would be really helpful for you to have her do on your behalf? And Deb, the same question for you. If you had a world-class illustrator like Brett that you could work with in some way, what would he do for you?
Do you want me to go first, or
either one who's willing and brave enough?
If I think I understand. I have a lot of experience in the book world, obviously, and I'm really intrigued by the opportunities that the new digital world have presented. And I know there's a lot of concern about books and and how they'll fare. And I hope that we'll always have books, but I can see that technology we have opens a lot of doors and can kind of enhance the storytelling, but I just don't know how to begin thinking about it. So if I had Deb for a day or a week, it would just be to open my mind on if you've got a good book and a good story in a traditional sense, where do you take that to the next, to get it into that digital world, and not to replace the story, but just to expand upon it and open some doors there.
Yeah.
Just more storytelling, hopefully.
I think you're thinking about it in the right way. So there are so many apps out there that are books that are basically just read-along books, right? And there's something beautiful about the book in its existing form that does not necessarily need to be technologically remediated, right? There's something magical about the experience that an individual has with a paper book. And I don't think you can replicate that online or digitally or in an app or on a device. But what I would tell you is, if you wanted to move into the digital realm, think about some of the stories you've written or that you will write that think about ways to bring a child into those stories in a more interactive way. Or think about a story that you've written that has a strong interactive component, almost like a choose-your-own-adventure story. There's a linear flow to it, but the child can involve himself or herself in the story itself, whether that's being part of the story as it unfolds, or engaging with the characters in an interesting way, or making the characters do something that they might not do ordinarily. Thinking about how to get that level of engagement where the child is actually the storyteller. The story will already be there. The child will actually lead him or herself through the story, but make them feel as though they're the ones unfolding the story as they go. And it doesn't work for every story, and it doesn't work for every book. But thinking about ways to make those characters come alive and really drive the story from the child's perspective.
Well, I think
again, people think about how kids like things to be nonlinear, like we talked about earlier. If kids really like things to be nonlinear, they'd read a book from the middle out, right? They wouldn't follow the story. So there really does need to be that level of structure. And I think having the story selected that does pull the child in an interesting way is a really interesting, engaging way to think about storytelling in this digital world that we live in.
Well, we've come back to a theme that we started with, namely storytelling, and I think it's a good place to end. I want to thank both of you, expert storytellers for kids, Brett Helquist and Deb Gelman, for joining us today. That was just a ton of fun, and thanks for joining us again.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
That was a blast. It really was.